JT Crowley is Talking Books. On the show, you'll hear from emerging talent and seasoned veterans from around the world.
Hello, I'm JT Crowley. I'm the host of Talking Books Show on Web Talk Radio. And today I have the honourable pleasure of talking to Dr. Barry Wren from Sydney in Australia. He's a retired distinguished medical professor, and his field of expertise, everybody, was in general terminology, obstetrics and gynaecology. But he's not come on the show to talk about that issue. He's come on to talk about the book he has written, Sex for Females Only. What's the book about? Well, I'm not going to tell you, because the best person to tell you is the author himself. So I'm going to invite Dr. Barry Wren on to talk about his book, but for the purpose of the podcast, he's asked to be called Barry. So I've formally introduced him, but we will be calling him Barry throughout the interview. So, Barry, would you like to come and join me on the show to talk about yourself and your book, Sex for Females Only?
John, I'd be delighted, and thank you very much for inviting me. My book is really a history of what happened to women over the last 3,000 to 4,000 years. I find that at present, in our present sociology, we have lots of people think there's a big difference between the way that men and women treat each other at present. It's gender inequality, and there's a lot of crying in that particular area. But my real reason for looking at this is to look at the problem which has not changed over those 3,000 to 4,000 years. Men are big and strong and dominant, and were like that when 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, and women were small and rather passive. So they pushed the women around and said, you must do this or that. And the main reason that they had women in their society was to look after the men, to be really a servant to them. They were subjected to these people, but they also provided sexual opportunity for the men, and the men wanted to have male infants born to follow them. So that started thousands of years ago, and followed, and women were being taught that they had to follow those rather passive approaches. There's very little difference, even now, in our present century. We find that a lot of men think that they're stronger and better and should have a more dominant role in the household. And the end result is a lot of conflict. Sometimes women are beaten up. Sometimes women are actually killed by their partner because she's not following what he wants. So life hasn't really changed, and all the problems are still there. I'm trying in the book to bring the thought that the discrepancy, the dissonance which occurs between men and women at present really has been exactly the same for the last 4,000 or 5,000 years. And that's what I'm talking about in the book.
And when I look at your book, Barry, I think what you've just said is absolutely right. And the book really does home in on some of these issues. Some of them are very, important issues, some are very powerful. And when you look at Dr. Wren's book, this book does pack a good punch. It's a short book, everybody, but there's a lot going on in it. It's a busy, busy book. So let's open up the book and let's head off to chapter 2. Now, everybody, there are 14 chapters in this book, but we're not going to go to all of those 14 chapters. We're going to go to 6 of them so that you can get a taste and a bit of a flavour as to what this book is about. So what I want to do is go to chapter 2, and I'm going to ask Barry, what's in this chapter? So you head this chapter up, Barry, the hierarchy of sex. And I thought that was a fascinating headline. You start the chapter, I quote, "For thousands of years, males appeared to dominate the sexual hierarchy in the gender relationship. But during the past few centuries, females have begun to not only achieve equality, but potentially may, in the future, dominate the gender partnership. As admiration and acclamation of their beauty, their sexuality, and their prowess prove to be the most significant feature in a relationship." You go on to talk about ancient times in certain areas of the world, in particular the Middle East and the Roman era. Would you care to tell us why you're focusing on the issues you have raised here, and what fundamental message can the reader conclude from your observations here so early in the book?
Well, it really comes back to what is an attractive woman. The most attractive women are the very young ones, the adolescents. Children between about the age of 10 to 13, 14 began to develop breasts and other tissue, which is purely genital, female genital tissue. They menstruate and potentially can become pregnant. They're the joy for a man to actually possess a partner like that makes that partner a very, very important person. She's good when she's young, and people fight over her. They worship her. If you look at the mythology of various events which have happened in those years, thousands of years ago, mostly it was a very attractive young woman who was fast, great runner. She looked good, and that's what everybody wanted to be like her. You can look at the various stories that always have a young woman, very attractive young woman, being very athletic and very attractive, and men fighting over her and having close contact with her. Occasionally, some of the men actually acquired one of those women and protected her until she became old, and when they then dismissed her. So being young and attractive was the major thing which was happening in those years, and those women were worshipped. They actually were, men loved to have them. They were like a trophy that they had put them up on the pedestal for the period of time that they owned them. This is long before we had what we call Christian marriages. It was that people owned, or they developed some relationship between an older, wealthy, powerful male and a young woman who might be anything between 12 or 13 years of age, and who grew up into the matriarch of the family. But as soon as she started losing the lure which she normally had, she was being discarded and replaced by another young woman. So this change of a woman's character depended entirely on what was happening to her body and the way she presented.
I totally agree with you. Women were seen as trophies in those days, and they weren't there for their mindset, their brains. They were there for their body, and they were there for a purpose, reproduction and sexual enjoyment. And
Exactly.
we do see that there's a change now, and which is extremely the right thing. And when you look as far as how women have come, well, we might be getting the first woman president of the United States of America. The most powerful person in the world could be a woman. What a change. What a change.
That would be one of the great benefits we could all get with. It's very interesting that you were saying those points, but some of the very important points in that whole sphere then was that young women were often neglected completely if they didn't match up to the what was expected of them.
Yes. If they didn't come up to scratch, they were abandoned.
Dismissed.
Dismissed, yeah. Now let's move on here, Barry. I want to go to chapter 3 because, as I says, there are 14 chapters, but we're going to go to 6. And they are short chapters, but they sure pack a powerful punch. Each chapter does, everybody. Now, chapter 3, Barry, sex, politics. Now, this is an interesting area of debate. Do sex and politics run favorably side by side? Possibly, possibly not. These days, but they certainly had powerful connotations in the past. The paragraph that stood out for me was paragraph 3 in this chapter. Quote, in those ancestral years of emerging human civilizations, the use of and the attraction of sex were mandatory in the educational curriculum. For many years, in the intelligent, attractive, and charismatic females, they employed a range of wiles and devices, including their sexual potential and availability. They had specialized skills, talents, devices, arts, and knowledge in order to advertise their advantages to dominate a male of interest. Plus, you go on to talk about how these females use their provocative powers over dominant men in the political arena to influence and change political thinking. Would you care to open up here and converse with me as to what you're driving at on this chapter here?
Well, there was several thousand years ago a war going on between two tribes, if you like, or cities in Greece. And the women didn't like it. So they got together and said, let's withhold all our sexual favours altogether until they stop fighting. And by doing that, they eventually did that, they solved the problem. And women have this ability to do so. They're much more gentle, much more placid in many different ways than men are. And I think it's something which we should try to encourage as much as we possibly can. There are several other things which you were involved, talk about this. In the wisdom of men, particularly older men, they say that these younger women, and this is the religious part of our nature as well, they say we shouldn't be using any kind of sexual activity or imposing sexual action on young women because they're too young. That's probably quite true, but there's a lot of women begin to menstruate when they're 10 or 11 and could quite easily become pregnant. So with their wisdom, men have gone to Parliament and said, we'll have a level, if a man has sexual activity with a woman under a certain age, then he is a criminal. It could be that the young woman was very happy to have sexual activity because it was an exciting experience and something that she wanted to eventually achieve. And I don't think that many politicians take into account the fact that both males and females generally have some of these needs. It's perfectly normal to have it. What we have to do is to educate people, not punish people when something like that occurs. I don't agree with the punishment of a man having intercourse with a female who's under the age of 16. I don't think that requires punishment. I think it requires education and support from all the people involved. But I might stand by myself in that particular feeling. I just don't think it's necessary to be as punishing as they seem to be at present. That's partly political.
And I would probably say it's partly what you've experienced, in your own profession. You were a professor, a consultant in the field of obstetrics and gynaecology, and you probably saw a fair amount of young girls in carrying a child.
Exactly. And if we look at some in the past, we find people like the Catherine the Great of Russia was 14 when she was engaged to marry, I think it was Prince Louis, and married him when she was 17. But apparently it had several episodes of sexual activity with other people before that event. Not only she, but there were other young women. We look at Marie Antoinette, who eventually was decapitated. But when she was 13, her mother arranged for her to become Louis, I think it was, she was to become the Queen of France. And she had many relationships, many sexual relationships before her 16th birthday. So it was perfectly normal in those days for young women to be accepted because they're beautiful and they were sexually active. You wouldn't want to punish all the people who had affairs under those conditions.
And when you look back, Barry, yes, a lot of the European royal households, women were brought in for one purpose, to produce a boy heir. And they were looking for the young women because they assumed that, the young girl would carry the child without any, medical history, whereas an older woman might have issues. So that's why they went for that. And then, of course, it was all about money and power. It was nothing to do with love or marriage at all.
No, none of these people ever had any of the risk or the chances to have emotional and a loving relationship before they got married or before they had sexual intercourse. I think it's wrong. I think we should learn better, teach better, but don't punish all the time.
An interesting viewpoint. So, Barry, I want to move on now, and I want to go to chapter 5. And I think any interviewer couldn't miss this chapter, particularly when you headed up Sex for Sale. And yeah, absolutely. And of course, in ancient times, in certain cultures, a girl was seen as a financial burden on her family, particularly if she came from a very poor background. So if somebody came along with some money to buy her, well, the family would sell her. That was just life back in those days. So sometimes young girls were seen as a financial product, a commodity to be used. Whether you agree with that or whether you don't, everybody, that's just what happened. And this is what Barry is talking about here. So, because a lot of young women back in those days, young girls, their role in the family, in society, was there to please their father, please their master, please everybody except themselves, basically.
Exactly.
Would you care to elaborate here, Barry?
I don't think anybody could elaborate on what you just expressed there because that's exactly what it was about. But so many young women were sold either into slavery. I mean, you pay a fair amount of money in those days for a slave, particularly if she was between, say, 10 and 20 years of age, because you knew that she would mature and be available for you when you needed it and so on like that. And then when you got tired of her, it was easy as a slave to put her out into some other sort of thing. She would go into prostitution or something like that. those sort of times haven't really changed. They've sophisticated some of the ways of doing it nowadays. But I hear, and I've had to deal with many women who, when they were first sort of engaged with some young man nowadays, and then by the time they're 18 or 19, they want to get out of the relationship and go off and do something different. There's been a lot of those sort of things happening. Lack of education, lack of understanding is not the best way of, is what we should be doing, but at present, they punish people if they step out of these lines. It's wrong.
So we know when we look at that chapter, everybody, Barry goes into quite a bit of detail, and it's to make you think. That's what it's about, to make you stop and think. Now, let's go to another chapter where you do exactly the same. And this is chapter 7. And you head this up, sex and historical mythology. Wow, what an interesting conversation, topic, subject matter this is, everybody. And I found the some of the areas extremely intriguing, and you've highlighted. You're talking about here the Hebrew Torah, the Garden of Eden, and its origins and location, because that was in Mesopotamia, that is in Iraq, all around there. The Adam and Eve story, the fading achievements of aging women being replaced by young, fresh, nubile girls, and male attitudes that existed in the past still coexisting in certain male bastions today. So for me, I found the storyline here very apt. But would you, Barry, care to tell us and reveal what's the core backdrop here and its significance in relation to the whole concept of your book?
Oh, that's the book has so many points which I think were important, and it was very significant there. And you probably just have to remind me a little. I fancy that the Garden of Eden that everybody hears about, that was that land which lay between the two major rivers running out of Turkey at that stage. And lots of people thought about it there. But in the myth that was developed, God planted plants and animals and fish and birds into that area there. And he then put Adam in there to look after the whole process. And Adam became very, very bored with what he was doing, and he wanted a companion. So God made a companion for him out of one of his ribs. This sort of bit of mythology of how we were created is one of the greatest problems, because from that point onwards, when Christianity spread across Europe during those 2,000 years now, a lot of people still believe that that's a true story. They don't believe it was one which was made up. And unfortunately, people still think about Adam and Eve. And Eve was the evil woman because she ate from the tree of knowledge. We all would love to get that tree of knowledge ourselves, but she ate from that and was then discarded from the whole Garden of Eden. That went down, and a lot of people lost their lives because that particular type of mythology persisted. Male dominance and women being at fault all the time. In my book, I've mentioned several instances like that, but I think that mythology is one of the biggest problems we have, is to look at reality rather than religious and myths which have persisted in these areas. I get a little upset about it sometimes when I think of how people's lives are affected by myths rather than by truth. And this is one of the reasons why I have that chapter in there about how women develop into these beautiful creatures that we look at and the hormones that are involved in that. Of course, that's some of the important things about maintaining health. We all know at least some of the main hormones like estrogen and progesterone. We've heard of those. These they're part of the hormones which develop a woman into this beautiful creature which we have, and one which
I'm going to stop you there because you cover off in another chapter, chapter 9. And I'm going to come to that one. So yeah, I just want to recap on that last chapter over there. Yeah, it's the difference really between Christian ideology and what some people in the world of science would say true evolution. So that little story really is about myths, and it's a fascinating chapter. But I'm now going to take you on because Barry was jumping the gun a little bit, everybody. So I've had to pull him back here because I want to go through this so that you get the overall picture here. So we're going to go to chapter 9, sex hormones. Now, hormones, a lot of people say, well, they've got an awful lot to answer for. And I think I agree with them. But you start this chapter with asking, what makes a woman tick? And what makes her sexually attractive? You go on to talk about the individual role of certain hormones. Now you can talk about your hormones. Off you go.
I'm just going to quickly give a little background to it. When anything happens to us, we get our messages to the brain. The messages are generally conveyed by a nerve, and if we touch something hot or do something somewhere or another, we get a message which goes within fractions of a second to our brain, and our brain will respond to that. But if we eat some food or we find ourselves cold or something is happening to us, we have another pathway, and that's the pathway which is hormones. Hormones are produced, we think, probably about 150. I think about 100 have been identified now, but they all act and they pass in blood through the brain, and the brain has certain cells there which can detect the smallest amount of a particular chemical passing through. So if there are not enough particular messages getting there, the brain sends a message out, again, a type of hormonal message. It's a chemical product to a particular gland or cells and says, pick up and start working. And that's exactly what happens. Women begin to produce estrogen. That's the main one from the ovary. They produce that estrogen at about the age of 8 or 10, and it begins to have an effect of producing growth of sexual tissue, breasts and vulva and vagina and other tissue in preparation for a pregnancy at some stage. And most young women, somewhere between the ages of 10 and 12 or 13, are menstruating, and all the tissue is ready then to produce a baby. So it's important. The hormones are there. And if we lose those hormones, then, of course, the cells don't work. There's no message there. So the cells fade away and either disappear or certainly don't function. That's what happens when a woman reaches the menopause. What happens is that she's born at birth with about 2 million eggs in her 2 ovaries. She uses an awful lot of those eggs every time she menstruates. Eventually, she runs out of those eggs, usually about the age of 45 or even up to 50. And the production of the hormones, there's at least 6 or 7 different hormones, but estradiol is the most important one that stimulates the tissue that makes a young woman grow into these beautiful young women that we love so much. When the eggs run out from the ovary, so does the production of the hormones. So those special cells and organs begin to fade and become old and worn out. They're not there. They don't even function. And this is the next part of my book, is why the hormones are important, and women can maintain their hormonal or their cellular activity by taking the right hormones. And that's why gynaecological endocrinologists are very important for them to see, get some information from under those conditions. I could go on with all that. It's very
I know you could, because now he's going back to his doctorate days, everybody, where he's sitting in his practice or he's talking to a patient, which is slightly different to the book. So we'll move on. Now, as I said, there are 14 chapters, but I want to go to chapter 12, which I found very revealing. And again, it's still around the menopause. Now, you headed up sex and menopause. So it's coming from a different angle here. You touch upon some sensitive areas here and some outdated taboos around menopausal issues. And while the vast majority of men today regards their relationships with females as being cultured, egalitarian, equal, however, they still exist in some societies, some cultures, some communities, a prehistoric attitude, if that's the right words to use, that still hold the view that women are of a lesser gender and that their ill treatment is still perfectly acceptable. It's a short but very full-on chapter. Talk us through it, Barry.
It's a very difficult area to talk about there. Do you mind if I just look at something I said?
Carry on. I just love it, everybody, when we're chatting away. And this book is amazing. It's powerful. It packs a lot of punches. It cuts through a lot of myths. And it's not just for females, actually. Men can learn a lot from this book as well. So this is why we're just giving you the sample shot of what it's about. And if you really want to know more about it, well, simply go and buy the book. I can say no fairer than that. So, Barry, have you got your place in the book?
Well, that was chapter 12.
It is chapter 12 we're on, yeah.
And that, the menopause, those same hormones that produce this beautiful young woman with breast development and her vagina and labia growing well, and everything is beautiful in a girl between the ages of 10 and 30, it's great. When she reaches her menopause and she's run out of those eggs from her ovaries and she's not producing any more hormones, and the main one being estradiol, but progesterone is there, then a number of cells begin to, they just don't function because there's no hormone there to make them function. And a lot of women have bones begin to become fragile and fracture because there's no estrogen to stimulate the normal growth of bone tissue. In her brain, there are certain other cells there undergo a failure, so she ends up with an earlier amount of dementia or changes leading to dementia. Her cardiovascular system and all the blood vessels around the heart and the arteries being pumped out, they also begin to undergo atrophic changes. So these women tend to end up, they still stay alive, but their body is gradually deteriorating. And it doesn't just, they just lose the desire to have sex. They lose the enjoyment of sexual interaction. They lose all the normal things which for 20 years really excited them. And now as they're getting older, there is a decrease in these women's abilities. They still have a memory of what was going on and would still like to be able to have a good sexual activity and to have a partner. And many of them do, but the majority of them begin to deteriorate. And that's where I got very excited about it 30, 40 years ago and started the first of the major groups in the world. There were about a dozen of us got together and decided to push the idea of hormonal therapy, and it became a pretty common thing to say HRT, and that was it. But of course, since then, everything has become much better and much improved and less dangerous and so on. It's just marvellous the way advances have been made in that area.
And of course, we see, Barry, yes, we used to see older men with younger women, and society looks upon that and goes, yeah, we know what's going on there, maybe. But then now we start to see more mature women dating younger men.
They look good.
The tide is turning, isn't it?
I'm delighted when I look around now. Now, I can remember when I was beginning my career, that's now 60 years ago, and then 60 years ago, old women would come into the clinic with many problems and say, I'm not feeling well, I'm not functioning well, but go on. Nowadays, I'm stopped practicing, by the way, so I don't want any woman coming in now. But nowadays, I know that so many of my female friends are taking hormonal therapy, and they look just gorgeous. They're marvellous. They're in their 70s and 60s, and some of them are even older than that. They're
what they look like. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now,
they're marvellous. We're still on hormonal therapy.
and we men might be getting it. Well, that's coming down the line. Now, Barry, that's a separate issue, everybody. Now, Barry, this book isn't a book of salacious tittle-tattle around sex. Let's make that very clear, everybody. Even though the title is Sex for Females Only. It's not for females only. It's for men and females and anybody of any gender, how they identify themselves. And now I understand that you want to emphasize certain key areas around particular issues, which mean a lot to you. Matters that you have witnessed over many years as a professor in your field of obstetrics and gynaecology. What are those 3 or 4 topical issues that you want to get into this interview?
The first thing is that women should not ever be a commodity. They should be revered and loved and enjoyed because they are an individual in their own right. The males don't own them, and they should never be using them as a commodity to gain more money, more power, more whatever it might be. That is gradually changing, but I still see many signs that is occurring. There's still many young women now who we see up on stage giving a song, and they're beautiful, good long body and nice legs, good breast tissue. It looks great. When you find that they've just become attached in some way, married or in some way, to somebody who's 30, 40 years older because he's got more money and more power and has persuaded this young woman that he's going to look after her properly. It's just a trophy in his mind. He plays for it. Some men, I know.
But I will come and I will bring a contradiction in here. She's probably also thought, and she's, yes, this guy, he's 30 odd years older than me. He's got money. I'll use my brain instead of my heart. and I'll use him for my own purposes. That's equally what goes on.
Oh yes, yeah. That's a tit for tat. That one.
It is.
But that's I know that happens as well, and a lot of women do look for an older, wealthier man, and waiting for him to pass on to another sphere, and they then get the money and can do what they want later on. That's quite true, but the first part is the young woman who is yet immature in many ways. When I say not sexually, she's very active from that point of view, but immature in politics and the financial sort of manipulation which happens.
The way of life.
The way of life, that's a nice way of saying it. And that's quite true. And she is used before she gets a chance to enjoy life. It's a struggle for her all the way. And when she thinks she's reached the top, that's not the top. There's still something going on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love women, and I love to help them as much as I can. And I look back at the misuse by men of their power over women in those days. It's changing, and now women have so much power. Their sexuality is a powerful thing, as powerful as any man's strength, muscular strength. But men still bash their woman around, which is wrong.
Winston Churchill once said, "Wars are not won on, war. It's you're talking and using your abilities to achieve things." That wasn't the exact quote, everybody, but he says, yeah, what he was getting at is saying that, yes, physical strength and armament don't win wars. Mindsets and hearts and minds win wars. And you can relate that to a little bit in the field of sexual relationships between, whatever genre that you choose, whatever is right for you.
The one I'd like to just bring in there, one corollary about this is that right now we've got 4 or 5 major wars going on around the world. The people who instigated those wars are always a male who's instigated them, and it's the women even now. If you look at the various people who are against it, like that old Greek group of people, women said, we'll withdraw our sexual behaviour, but women are now saying, stop this stupid war. And that's it. You never win a war. You may conquer something, but you don't win it. And the same people that you've beaten into subjection are never going to love you.
No, they're not. I found that, Barry, your book was very, very interesting. I said, yes, it's short, it's punchy, it's powerful, and it's not just only for females. No. Where do people get your book from, Dr. Barry?
Well, apparently, although it's printed in America, it is available in most of the countries by Amazon. I understand is probably one of the major ones. Certainly, they're supplying most of the people in Australia with my book, and I'm sure you've got similar companies in England as well as Amazon who could do that as well. I really don't know, but I'm sure there would be no problem getting it. It's only been out for a period of a few weeks now, but I understand that it's selling to people around the world, and I'm hoping it sells a lot because I need the money.
Oh, poor old soul. He needs the money to play his golf. I just want to say, Dr. Barry G. Wren, thank you so much for coming on my show and giving me the wonderful opportunity to look at your book and talk to you about it.
John, I've been delighted to be invited, and you've been so good in doing all the right things for me there and helping me with the promotion of this book here. Thank you.
I'm JT Crowley. Thanks for listening wherever you are in the world. Stay safe. Until next time.